Hi there, Social Studies 20, taking a look here at foreign aid and internationalism in today's lesson. Just a quick review of where we've been. We talked about international laws and agreements the other day. We talked about peacekeeping versus peacemaking. Is it effective? Is it realistic? We talked about economic sanctions and whether or not they're effective. And just the concept of promoting peace, and that quite often what we find is that countries that democratize, that embrace democracy, need less international help, aid, and so on. And we talked about the feasibility of that. And we talked about where you find internationalism, and that when you embrace internationalism, you are going to give up a degree of sovereignty. We talked about the different kinds of internationalism and different forms of aid and help as well. And so today's lesson will not be long, probably about 10 minutes and not much more than that. We're going to look at foreign aid and the role that it plays in internationalism. This is one of the most highly criticized and volatile topics when we talk about internationalism, foreign aid. And you probably know this, but every year billions of dollars, hundreds of billions of dollars are transferred, given from developing countries, so countries like Canada, America, and so on, to developing countries, so countries like maybe Sudan, Ethiopia, Eritrea, and so on, in the form of aid for humanitarian and other economic purposes. So when one country gives aid to another country, we call that foreign aid. And it can be bilateral, unilateral, or multilateral, as we've talked about. And this aid can be used to buy different things for that developing country, to purchase medical supplies, to food, clothing, shelter, the basic necessities, maybe infrastructure, sewage treatment, building roads, trains, and so on, things like that, through foreign aid as a form of internationalism. So this one's more economic in nature, and this one's highly criticized. One thing that you will see going forward, and if we were writing the final, I can see the question in my head. The 0.7% solution was actually passed by Lester B. Pearson, a former prime minister in Canada. And what the 0.7% solution means, it's a really good example of foreign aid and internationalism. Um, the world's wealthiest countries, so America, Britain, France, China, I don't know, Russia, and so on, if they gave 0.7%, so 0.7% of their gross national income, so the amount of money that those countries make in a year, if they gave just 0.7% of that money, you could solve global poverty very, very quickly. The gross national income is just the total value of money that your country produces in a given year, whether it's from a company inside your country or a multinational outside of your company. That's not really important. So that's the 0.7% solution, an example of internationalism. And Pearson was probably right. If those wealthy countries gave just 0.7% of their GNI to foreign aid, you would solve global poverty very, very quick. So that shows you the potential of internationalism and foreign aid. However, however, only a handful of countries have actually done this. Denmark, Luxembourg, the Netherlands, Norway, and Sweden. They've either met the target, and some have even gone beyond Pearson's target. Canada, at most, has given just 0.33%, which is only half of the 0.7% solution. And when we think of Canada, we think of, and justifiably so, Canada is renowned as a giving, generous, wealthy, developed country. And it just shows you the reality of internationalism. If a country like Canada can't or won't make it happen, won't give 0.7%, um, it shows you the drawbacks of internationalism, that all that potential is there, but unless all countries agree to do it and go forward with it, um, it doesn't work. Just like global warming will not be fixed unless all countries agree and commit to fighting global warming and things like that. 0.7% solution is much the same. And so just use it as an example of the potential of internationalism and global poverty, and the downside, that no one's making you do it. You have to do it voluntarily as a country. And countries would have a variety of reasons for not going along with it. I mean, countries um, have trouble in their own backyard. I mean, after all, there is poverty in Canada. Canada's coming out of a recession, and we're about to go back into a recession. So you can understand to a point why it doesn't happen. Um, and then it's not really a solution if countries don't go along with it and make a commitment to it. Foreign aid and foreign aid policy is often criticized, so we've got all this potential, but there are things that get in the way of making it work. So one of the biggest motivations for foreign aid is humanitarianism, in that you want to help other people. Maybe you want to guarantee them the basic rights under the Declaration of the Rights of Man from the UN. Right? So quite often we're motivated by just wanting to help. We do want to do the right thing, but things get in the way. Other motives, can inspire or detract from countries that operate. So quite often, political interests get in the way. Maybe historical relationships or animosity can get in the way. One of the most common forms of foreign aid that is highly criticized is tide aid. So tide aid is when you give another country money, but there are strings attached. In other words, yeah, we're giving you this money, but you have to do this if you want to get the money first. So what we get is donor countries will often give foreign aid to a developing country only if that developing country buys goods and services from the donor country. So, for example, Canada will give foreign aid to Ethiopia, but Ethiopia's got to buy Canadian made products. And it just makes you wonder, is this really in the spirit of generosity, or are you doing this because it's helping Canada? And quite often, maybe it's helping Canada more than it's helping the country we're giving the money to through these strings that are attached. All countries do it. It's not just Canada. And so, what happens is if Canada agrees to give foreign aid to Ethiopia, Ethiopia has to make a commitment to buy Canadian made products that might be of a lower quality than they can buy from someone else, that might be at a higher price than they can hire or buy from somebody else. So that is tied aid. Yeah, we're going to help you out. We're going to give you money, but you've got to help us first. You've got to help us too. Now, that can be a good or a bad thing. I mean, the bad thing is obvious. You're not really doing this to help another country, and in some ways, you're actually hurting that country because they have to buy your stuff, no matter how crappy it might be or how expensive it might be. Um, but again, it's the reality of the world, and you know, there's no law saying that Canada has to give to Ethiopia or Eritrea or Sudan. Maybe there needs to be something in it for Canada to get them to do it. That might just be a political and economic reality. So I guess what we're trying to say is tide aid is not a full embracement of internationalism because you're still protecting the donor country. You're not just giving to the country that's getting these donations. When aid's given with no strings attached, it's usually better. It usually helps both countries a little more, but that doesn't happen often. And finally, crisis aid is aid that you give to cope with an immediate disaster or some kind of an event. So if there's a civil war, if there is a genocide, if there is a tsunami or an earthquake, crisis aid is aid given to save people's lives right then and there. It is very immediate. And that's a good thing, and that anytime there's a crisis, X number of people die, but way more could die without the crisis aid. And if it's an environmental crisis like an earthquake or a tsunami, quite often more people are at risk of dying from dehydration because they don't have clean, fresh drinking water than they are of dying of the actual crisis itself. So crisis aid is really important. It saves lives every year, all the time. The downside is if you were to play devil's advocate, why not give aid more often? Why are you just waiting for the crisis? In other words, if you committed to a regular aid package and you gave regularly and generously to a developing country, You might not need to give crisis aid because they could become more autonomous. They could become more independent and not need your crisis aid when the crises percolate and rear their heads. In other words, if you helped poor countries, if you help their economies and help them develop and become economically prosperous, they could deal with their own crisis and they wouldn't need your crisis aid when those things happen. It might actually save the donating countries money down the long road. But countries are very reluctant to give generous long-term aid, and there's a variety of reasons for it. Um, it's just it doesn't work out as perfectly in theory as you might think. One of the reasons is because of corrupt officials and the country that perhaps you're giving the aid to. Um, to make a long story short, if you give money to a poor country like Ghana, for example, that money is filtered through what is known as the bureaucracy. So aid given to Ghana from maybe Canada has to go through a series of layers of government officials before it actually gets to the people that really need it, civilians. And so the example they've got here is that when you give aid to Ghana, it's got to go through at least 15 government organizations before the people that get the money actually get the money. The people that need the money get the money. And by that time, the money's diluted. There's not very much of it left. And you have to wonder how effective is it really? And so the topic of foreign aid is a two-headed monster in that in some cases it's got a lot of potential. We probably should be doing more, but then the critique will always be, well, how do I know where that money's going? Who's taking that money? You need to understand that in a lot of the countries you're giving money to, your donation isn't going to the people. Your donation is going to the dictator of that country. Um, Idi Amin is a good example of this. Idi Amin was a dictator in Uganda in the 1960s and 70s. Canada and other Western democracies, they gave billions of dollars to Uganda. Very little, if any, of that money went to the people that needed it. Idi Amin took all the money and he made himself very, 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 very wealthy. We made him a billionaire. We made Idi Amin a billionaire through foreign aid. He skimmed, if not all the money, most of it, meaning that people that we were trying to help in Uganda were still starving. They were still dying. They still didn't have the basic needs. But Idi Amin was a billionaire at our hand, at our doing. Now, I'm not saying we shouldn't give that foreign aid. I do think it's the right thing to do. But you can see why someone would be reluctant to give this aid out, not knowing where it's going. Am I just making the problem worse? And in the case of Idi Amin, he was a ruthless, bloodthirsty dictator. He murdered tens of thousands of his own people. So not only did he take the bulk of the foreign aid money, but he used that money to kill off enemies and innocent people in Uganda that we were trying to help in the first place. And so as that happens more and more, as people hear about that more and more often, they're reluctant to give foreign aid in that where's the money going? Am I making the problem worse? And not to mention, you've got your own problems back home in your country too. And maybe you don't feel like this is doing much good. Well, that's a something that you have to decide for yourself. You will be voting one day, and you'll part of any politician's political platform is what's their foreign aid package. How do they want to help other countries? How will they go about doing that? So I can't answer that one for you. And that's that. I'm putting together. Well, I'll tell you after. You don't need to hear that right now. I hope you got something out of that. You should be spending the rest of the class now watching Ghosts of Rwanda. Don't forget that that documentary is going to culminate with you evaluating and rendering a verdict on who is to blame for the Rwandan genocide in 1994. Good job today. Thanks for listening.